Every year on Easter Sunday, Christians gather to celebrate the resurrection. The word in Greek is anastasis, which means literally to stand up again. It's a reference to the fact that on Good Friday, the enemies of Jesus knocked him down, they nailed him to a cross, they hung him up to die, they laid his cold, lifeless body in a tomb. But early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, he stood up again. "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" the angel said to the women. "He is not here, but has risen." That's what we celebrate at Easter. But that's not all. 1 Corinthians 15 is sometimes called the resurrection chapter, in which Paul argues that not only Jesus, but also all of us who belong to him will be raised from the dead. He argues so passionately and so persuasively that the resurrection of the body, rather than the immortality of the soul, became the official doctrine of the early church. In the 4th century, Christians began reciting the Nicene Creed, which says, "We look for the resurrection of the dead." The Apostles' Creed, written sometime later, makes it more personal. It says, "I believe in the resurrection of the body." Even now, the idea that our physical bodies will someday rise is the orthodox teaching of the church. But that doesn't mean that everyone believes it. The question of bodily resurrection came up after one of my recent sermons at First Baptist when I talked about the Hebrew word Nephesh, the one that is most often translated as soul. Tim Mackey from thebibleproject.com says, "That's unfortunate because the English word soul comes with lots of baggage from ancient Greek philosophy. It's the idea that the soul is a non-physical, immortal essence of a person that is contained or trapped in their body to be released at death. But that is not the biblical view. According to Mackey, the Hebrew word nephesh refers to the whole person. When the life breath goes out of a person, the nephesh remains. It's just called a dead nephesh, that is, a corpse. So in the Bible, people don't have a nephesh, rather they are a nephesh, a living, breathing, physical being. One person came looking for me as soon as church was over, saying, "Wait a minute, I've always heard that when your body dies, your soul goes to heaven. But you're telling me something different." I said, "I'm only telling you what the Bible says." Someone else wrote to me later that week with the same kind of concern. When I said, again, that the immortality of the soul is not the biblical view, he wrote back and said, "Well, it's the one I feel most comfortable with, so I'm keeping it." I didn't say so, but I was thinking, are you going to believe things that aren't biblical just because they're more comfortable? I wondered what was so hard about believing that when we die, we are completely dead, and that when God is good and ready, he will raise us up. And that's when it hit me that the hard thing for this man, and maybe for most of us, is time. Let me use a personal example. My father died a little more than 9 years ago. My mother died a few years after that. The two of them are buried on my brother's farm on a beautiful hillside in West Virginia that faces the rising sun. Their tombstone says, "In sure and certain hope of the resurrection. Here lie the mortal remains of James and Mary Rice Whiting Somerville." You could ask me, "Do you believe your parents are there in those graves?" And I would say, "No, I believe they are with the Lord." "But what about this tombstone that makes it sound as if they are just lying there waiting for the sun to come up on the day of resurrection?" Well, here's what I believe, but try to stay with me because it's complicated. I believe that the clock started ticking on the first day of creation when God said, "Let there be light." And I believe that someday the clock will stop ticking and time will come to an end. If you stretch out the timeline in space, it might look like this. But God is bigger than time. That's how he could be with Moses on Mount Sinai and with Jesus on Mount Calvary at the same time. But we're different. We are stuck on the timeline. We are slaves to the ticking clock. Slaves, that is, until we die, and when we do, I believe we step off the timeline and into the presence of God. Which may explain why Jesus could say to the thief on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." One of my seminary professors put it like this: the only thing that separates the day of your death from the day of your resurrection is time. And when time drops out of the equation, the two come together. The day of your death and the day of your resurrection are the same day. Now, that's mind-boggling. You might have to think about that for a while. None of us has ever lived outside of time. But while we are still thinking about it, Paul anticipates our next question. In 1 Corinthians 15:35, he writes, "But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come?" People have asked me that question, especially when a loved one has been cremated. People want to know how bodily resurrection works when there's not much of the body left. I usually say, I don't know how it works, but I trust the God who made the first man out of a handful of dust to remake your loved one out of a handful of ashes. That's what I say. But Paul, who must have skipped that class in seminary where you learn how to be gentle with people, says, "Fool, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And as for what you sow, you do not sow the body that is to be, but a bare seed, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body." It's an analogy, but a good one. I can still remember how disappointed I was as a boy to buy a packet of seeds at the hardware store with all those brightly colored flowers on the front, and then open it up to find only those dry, brown, shriveled up seeds. But my mother helped me plant them and water them, and in a few weeks' time there were flowers in my backyard more beautiful than those on the seed packet. It really is a miracle, isn't it? Paul simply claims that what happens to the bodies we bury in the ground or reduce to a pile of ashes is no more, but certainly no less miraculous than that. It's an analogy, a way of comparing something we don't understand with something we do understand in an effort to make sense of it. Jesus did it all the time. The author of John's Gospel tells us that in the beginning was the Word, meaning Jesus. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. But then the Word became flesh, and almost immediately the Word had a problem. How do you explain the wonders of heaven in the words of mere humans? It's hard. You have to use similes, analogies, metaphors, and parables. That's what Jesus did. He told his hearers that the kingdom of heaven was like a mustard seed, for example, or like finding treasure in a field. He did not tell them anything without using a parable, Matthew says. He didn't have a choice. Maybe Paul didn't either. In 2 Corinthians 12, he says he knew a man once who was taken up to the third heaven, which seems to be a modest way of talking about one of his own spiritual experiences. What did he see while he was up there? We don't really know. And when Paul tries to talk about those things, he too has a hard time putting them into words. He opens his mouth in a parable. He says that our resurrection bodies will be like the beautiful flowers that grow from a handful of dry, brown, shriveled up seeds. In that same chapter, he says, "Lo, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the sound of the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and those of us who are still alive will be changed. Do you know what he's talking about? I don't. And anyone who tells you they know what happens to you after you die, or what kind of resurrection body you will have, or when all of this is going to happen, is probably someone you should avoid. It's a mystery. But recently I had an experience that seems like a good analogy. One the Apostle Paul may have used if the Apostle Paul had used a smartphone. Because here's what happened. My phone was dying. I'd had it for 5 or 6 years and the battery just wouldn't hold a charge anymore. I'd charge it up overnight, take it with me to work, and by noon the battery would be down to 10%. Plus the memory was nearly full, which is another way of saying that, like me, my phone was having trouble remembering things. I put it off for as long as possible, but on my birthday, I ordered a new phone from Amazon. Well, not a new one. And this is what makes this such a good analogy. I ordered a renewed smartphone, one where they had taken an old phone and brought it back to life again with a new body and a new battery and an upgraded operating system. It was delivered that same day, my birthday. And when I took it out of the package, it was charged and ready to go. The instructions said that if I wanted to transfer the data from my old phone to the new one, all I had to do was put the two side by side and let modern technology work its magic. So I did. And about an hour later, my new phone was ready to go. And here is the amazing thing. When I picked it up and turned it on, there was my grandson's face looking back at me. How did it know? How did this phone that had been renewed in some distant factory and delivered from some random warehouse know that this was my grandson? And how did it know me? Because when I started looking through the apps, there were all my photographs, all my contact information, even my daily Bible reading plan was up to date. It seemed like a miracle. But what a good analogy of the resurrection body. Because my new phone has a battery that lasts practically forever, and my new phone has more memory than I will ever need, and my new phone can do things my old phone could never do. I want a resurrection body like that. I want a resurrection body that will download all the information from my old body, but make it new. And if Paul could talk to me now, I think he would say, it's coming. It's at the factory now. It will be in the warehouse soon, but when the time comes, it will be waiting. Frederick Buechner says, the thing that God, in spite of everything, prizes enough to bring back to life is not just some disembodied echo of a human being, but a new and revised version of all the things which made him the particular human being he was, and which he needs something like a body to express. His personality, the way he looked, the sound of his voice, his peculiar capacity for creating and loving, in some sense, his face. And more than his face, I suspect, his arms, her arms, arms that can hug you and hold you and welcome you home. Why would you settle for a disembodied soul when you could have all that?